If someone had told me that the greatest turning point of my life would begin beside an overflowing dumpster with a frightened little puppy, I would have laughed at them. But that's exactly what happened. I never thought surviving a war would be easier than surviving old age. At 83 years old, there was a morning when I stood in my kitchen holding a cold cup of coffee and wondered if anyone would notice if I simply disappeared. The medals I earned sat forgotten inside a drawer. My family photographs collected more dust than memories, and the loudest sound in my house was the ticking clock reminding me that another lonely day had begun. I'd faced enemy fire, buried brothers in uniform, and walked away from battles I never expected to survive. But nothing prepared me for the silence that comes when life slowly empties around you. People think growing old means becoming wiser. Sometimes it simply means becoming lonelier. When I was a young man, I believed life was measured by duty. I served my country with pride, and although there are things I saw that still visit me in my dreams, I never regretted wearing the uniform. When I came home, I found something worth fighting for all over again. I married the most wonderful woman I had ever known. She wasn't loud or flashy, but she had the kind of smile that made difficult days seem shorter. Together we built a simple life that felt rich in every way that mattered. We raised children, worked hard, paid our bills, argued over silly things, laughed at the dinner table, celebrated birthdays, and spent countless evenings sitting on our porch watching sunsets without saying much at all. She was my best friend long before people started using that phrase for everything. We didn't need grand adventures because we had each other. Whenever life knocked us down, one of us was always there to help the other back up. Looking back now, I realize those ordinary days were the greatest blessing I would ever receive. Time, however, has a way of taking attendance. First, I retired after decades of honest work. I thought retirement would feel like a reward, but after the excitement faded, the days began stretching longer than I ever imagined. Then, friends started disappearing. Every few months there seemed to be another funeral, another handshake, another folded flag, another family saying goodbye. Men I'd laughed with for decades were suddenly photographs on memorial tables. My wife tried to keep my spirits up, but then she became ill. At first we believed the doctors would fix everything. We held on to hope because that's what married people do. But hope has limits, and one quiet autumn afternoon I held her hand as she took her final breath. I remember sitting beside her hospital bed after everyone else had left, unable to understand how a room could feel so empty while still holding the love of my life. After her funeral, people told me she was in a better place. I never argued with them, but I couldn't help wishing that better place still had room for me. My children visited when they could, but they had families of their own, jobs in other states, responsibilities that couldn't simply be set aside. My grandchildren grew up, went to college, found careers, fell in love, and built lives that naturally carried them farther away. Nobody abandoned me. Life simply kept moving forward without asking whether I was ready to be left behind. The years after that became the hardest battle I ever fought, and unlike the wars of my youth, nobody could see the enemy. Every morning looked exactly like the one before. I'd wake before sunrise because old habits never really disappear, make coffee for one person instead of two, and sit at the same kitchen table staring at the empty chair across from me. Sometimes I turned on the television, not because I wanted to watch it, but because I couldn't stand the silence. I'd wander through the house, touching old furniture like I was visiting a museum of my own life. Her knitting basket still sat beside the couch. One of her favorite sweaters still hung in the closet because I couldn't bring myself to move it. I stopped cooking proper meals and settled for canned soup or frozen dinners. The yard that once made me proud became overgrown because I no longer cared enough to mow it on time. Neighbors would wave, and I'd wave back, but I rarely invited anyone inside. Eventually I stopped answering the phone as often because I grew tired of saying I was fine when we all knew I wasn't. The truth was that I wasn't living anymore. I was simply existing. People think loneliness means having nobody around. They're wrong. Loneliness is waking up and realizing nobody truly needs you anymore. That feeling can break a man far more quietly than any bullet ever could. One rainy afternoon, I carried a bag of trash out behind the house. I remembered grumbling about my aching knees as I slowly made my way toward the dumpster near the alley. Just as I lifted the lid, I heard a faint whining sound. At first I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard it again. I looked around until I spotted a damp cardboard box tucked beside the dumpster. Inside was the smallest puppy I'd ever seen. His fur was soaked, one ear drooped awkwardly, and his ribs showed through his muddy coat. He looked terrified, shivering so hard I wondered how he was still alive. For a moment I stood there telling myself someone else would come along. After all, I was an old man. I didn't need another responsibility. I barely felt capable of taking care of myself. Then the puppy looked up at me. I can't explain what happened in that moment. His frightened eyes looked exactly how I imagined my own must have looked every morning in the bathroom mirror. Lost, alone, waiting for someone to care. Without thinking, I slipped off my old army jacket, wrapped him inside it, and carried him home. He was so light I could barely feel his weight. But somehow he carried something much heavier away from me that day. The first few weeks were complete chaos. He cried through the night, chewed one of my favorite slippers, had accidents on the kitchen floor, and followed me so closely that I nearly tripped over him more times than I can count. I found myself laughing for the first time in years after catching him proudly carrying a sock 3 times bigger than he was. Every morning he wagged his tail as though seeing me was the greatest event in the world. He didn't care that I was old. He didn't know how many medals I had earned or how many people I'd buried. He only knew that I filled his food bowl, scratched behind his ears, and made him feel safe. Because he needed walks, I started walking again. At first it was just around the block, but before long we were exploring parks I'd forgotten even existed. Because he deserved healthy meals, I found myself cooking again instead of opening cans. Because he depended on me, I started taking better care of myself. My doctor noticed my blood pressure improving. My neighbors noticed I smiled more often. I even caught myself talking to him throughout the day like he understood every word, and judging by the way he'd tilt his head, maybe he did. I had spent years believing I rescued that little puppy from beside a dumpster. Looking back now, I know the truth. He rescued me from a darkness that had nearly convinced me there was nothing left worth living for. Our daily walks slowly introduced me back to the world I had been hiding from. Children would run over asking if they could pet him, and their laughter reminded me of my own grandchildren when they were young. Neighbors who had only waved from a distance began stopping to chat. One elderly widow admitted she'd been just as lonely after losing her husband. And before long we were sharing coffee once a week while our dogs played in the yard. My grandchildren started visiting more often because they adored the little rascal, and my house echoed with laughter again. Birthday dinners returned to my dining room. Holiday decorations came out of storage instead of remaining packed away. The puppy greeted every visitor like a long-lost friend, and somehow his excitement became contagious. Nothing inside my house had really changed, except one tiny heartbeat with 4 muddy paws, yet somehow everything felt different. I had purpose again. Every morning someone waited for me to wake up. Every evening someone rested his head on my lap as if to remind me I wasn't alone anymore. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was a beautiful one. I still miss my wife every single day. I still think about old friends whose voices I can almost hear whenever I pass places we used to visit together. Growing older doesn't erase grief. It simply teaches you how to carry it with a little more grace. For a long time I believed healing meant forgetting the pain. But now I understand that healing means making room for joy beside it. Sometimes I sit on the porch at sunset, just like my wife and I used to, with that once forgotten puppy now grown into an old gray-faced dog sleeping at my feet. I like to imagine she'd smile if she could see us. Maybe she'd laugh at how spoiled he has become. Maybe she'd remind me that love has a funny way of finding us when we need it most. I spent decades believing courage meant running toward danger while bullets flew overhead. It turns out the greatest act of courage in my entire life was opening my front door to one frightened little puppy. So if you're listening to my story tonight and your home feels too quiet, if you've convinced yourself that your best years are behind you, don't give up just yet. Life has a remarkable way of surprising us when we've stopped expecting miracles. Sometimes hope doesn't arrive with fireworks or fanfare. Sometimes it waits beside a dumpster on a rainy afternoon with muddy paws, frightened eyes, and a heart just as lonely as your own. And sometimes, if you're willing to bend down and pick it up, that little piece of hope will spend the rest of your life reminding you that you still matter, you are still needed, and it is never too late to find a reason to smile again.